Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Argentina, which is actually one of the countries that I've been covering since I started this channel. And during that time, the economy in Argentina has really struggled. But Javier Milei was appointed as the president in December 23, and this was seen as a new dawn, the changing of the guard, a fresh approach to try to change things up and put Argentina back on track and make it one of the biggest economies in the world again. But unfortunately, things haven't quite gone as well as expected. But over the last 6 months or so, we've started to see some green shoots of recovery. But one of the things that Javier Milei has focused on in his first 18 months in presidency is cutting costs, because it's always easier to control your costs than it is to control your revenue, because controlling revenue is obviously difficult because it's talking about exports, doing more trade, doing more business, but you can always cut back on costs. But the problem this is now causing in Argentina is that certain sectors of society are very unhappy about it. And one of those sectors are the pensioners, who've been protesting in every single month since Milei took over as the president, because they've been looking to get their pensions increased, and he's been vetoing that. And unfortunately, these monthly protests have now broken out into violence.
Clashes between police and protesters erupted outside Argentina's Congress on Wednesday, leaving dozens injured. Video showed officers in riot gear pushing through a crowd that included activists as well as retirees.
There doesn't look to be too many pensioners in that riot I've just seen there, but maybe these are people who are concerned about their future pensions, or generally just citizens of Argentina who are feeling aggrieved about what's going on. But certainly it doesn't look like it's a group of pensioners who are causing all of the trouble.
It broke out after lawmakers had fallen short of numbers needed to vote on pension hikes and continuity of benefits for retirees. Less than half of congressional lawmakers were present.
So what you can see here is that a lot of the lawmakers, the politicians, weren't actually present. They didn't turn up for this vote. And that would have been a deliberate ploy by some of the followers of Milei not to support this bill.
President Javier Milei's government, aiming to curb inflation through spending cuts, opposed both proposals repeatedly in 2024. Milei used his first presidential veto in September last year to block a law raising pensions and adjusting them for inflation. Since Milei took office in late 2023, retirees have been gathering weekly in Buenos Aires to protest against pension cuts.
So those people look a bit more like pensioners, and they're just standing around with placards looking a bit bored.
These demonstrations have grown over time, with unions and soccer fans joining the cause.
Not too many pensioners in that group just there.
Así que yo estoy acá.
On Wednesday in Congress, opposition lawmaker Paula Oliveto of the center-right Civic Coalition said the country's democracy couldn't turn a blind eye, while pensioners live on about $331 a month. While Socialist Party lawmaker Esteban Paulon condemned what he called an embarrassing scene when lawmakers laughed as the session collapsed. Milei's government argues that its resources are limited, and to increase pensions, the country must first see more investment and economic growth.
So I'll come on to talk about what's going on with economic growth in a moment, because the latest data that's been published shows that Argentina has fallen short of its expectations. But I thought it'd be interesting to compare the pension in Argentina with the other countries in the G20, which are notionally the 20 largest economies in the world, even though there's only 19 of them actually in the G20. And this chart tries to give a like-for-like comparison. So what I've shown here is the 20 countries, and this is ranked from the countries that pay the most for their national or state pension, or whatever you want to refer to it as, and the countries that pay the least. And then I've tried to adjust for the cost of living. So if we look at the actual pensions first, you can see that the USA ranks right at the top here, and the average pension being somewhere between $1,500 and $1,800, followed by Germany with between $1,300 and $1,500, France $1,200 to $1,500, then Italy, the United Kingdom, and let's not forget these figures are in US dollar equivalent. So if you're looking at the numbers thinking, I don't get paid that much, it's because I've converted it at the current exchange rates. So the UK is somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200, as is Australia. Japan comes in at number 7, followed by Saudi Arabia. Canada is number 9 here, with an average pension of between 550 and 600, followed by Turkey, Brazil. Argentina is down at number 12 with that figure of $331 that was quoted in that report, followed by Russia, between 250 and 300, Mexico, South Korea. China is number 16 with between $150 and $300. South Africa 17, Indonesia 18, and the bottom country on this list is India with an average pension of between $20 and $30 per month. Now, in terms of this cost of living index, what I've done here is I've assumed that the cost of living in New York is the benchmark. So obviously that's quite expensive. New York is an expensive place to live. So that is an index of 100. And then I've benchmarked the average cost of living in all of the other countries against the cost of living in New York. So you can see that on average in Germany, it's around 70% of the cost of New York, 74% in France, 67% in Italy, 73% UK, 85% Australia, and then picking out a couple of others, that's 85% in Canada. Argentina, it's 27%. So it's basically 4 times more expensive to live in New York than it is in Argentina on average. Russia, 35% compared to New York. And then India at the bottom of this list, it's 27%, so in line with Argentina. So if we then apply that cost of living index to the pension that's being paid, you can see that for the USA, obviously it's 100% because that is the benchmark starting point. Germany is relatively better off. So even though pensioners are being paid less, they're actually better in cost of living terms. It's pretty much they're twice as well off as they are in the USA, depending on where you live and how much you're getting. So that's obviously, if you're paid the top end of the German range of 1,500, that would be the same as the bottom end of the USA, but it's less expensive to live in Germany. And if we have a look at, just pick out a few select others in line with where the viewing audience is for my channel. So the United Kingdom, it's 73% on average, the cost compared with New York. So that means that the pension that's being paid in the UK, pensioners are better off than they are in the USA, almost 50% better off, depending on what you're getting. In Canada, it's actually worse. So you're getting paid less. The cost of living is slightly less, and it's somewhere between 65 to 70%, the pension versus the cost of living. So you're worse off in Canada than you are in the USA on average as a pension. This is just the state standard pension. So if you've got a company pension, private pension, you've saved some money of your own, that's not included in these figures. This is just if you had nothing and you were just being given what the state gives you, then this is what you'd be doing. Argentina, as a comparison, is actually better than the USA. So even though at $331 is a lot less than the pension you'd be getting in the USA, because the cost of living is 4 times lower on average, it's actually better. Pensioners have got more in their pocket at the end of the month than they have in the USA. And if we have a look at India at the bottom here, you can see that it's not a great situation because they're being paid between $20 and $30. And yeah, it's like 10 times worse than it is in the US. But I wanted to show this really to put into context what the Argentinian pensioners are being paid, because everything is relative. You can't compare the number against numbers for other countries because the cost of living is entirely different depending on where you live in the world. So what we're seeing here is actually Argentina is ranking pretty well against most of the rest of the countries on this list. It's better in relative terms than Japan, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Turkey, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, South Korea, China, South Africa, Indonesia, and India. So in relative terms, it doesn't look like the pensioners should be rioting or protesting as much as they have been, although as we discussed, I'm not sure how many pensioners are involved in those riots. But I thought this was a useful comparison just to put it into context. But obviously one of the big issues in Argentina isn't just how much you're being paid. It's also what's going on with inflation, because that figure of $331 will be reduced rapidly in terms of its spending power as inflation rises. And this chart shows the movement in the rate of inflation over the past 12 months. And as you can see here, the latest data for April 25 shows that inflation year on year is now running at 47.3%, which in isolation is horrific. 47% inflation is off the scale. Most countries in the world have never seen inflation at 47%. If that was in the Western world, the developed countries, that would be an economic collapse. That would be a complete disaster. However, when you look at what's been happening in Argentina, you can see that over the last 12 months, the situation has improved dramatically, because in April 24, inflation was running at 292%, which is unbelievable. And so 47% is good relative to 292, but it's still not good, because if you're being paid $331 as a pensioner and prices are rising almost 50% year on year, you need your pension to be rising at least 50% year on year just to stay standing still, to be able to buy as much as you're buying. So I think this is one of the reasons why pensioners are complaining in Argentina. And of course, if we look at what's been happening over the past 3 years, you can see that inflation has been a major problem for the whole of the last 3 years. And actually, the current rate of inflation is the lowest that Argentina has seen at any time. But it still doesn't mean that 47% is good. It's just better than what's been happening historically. And if we have a look at what's been going on with the monthly movement in inflation, because those figures we've just looked at just compares like for like 12 months over 12 months. But this shows us what's happening month on month. And you can see that in April, prices increased by 2.8%. So that is the increase from this time last month. So that's not 2.8% per year, which is what we're seeing in some of the developed economies at the moment. That's the target rate, somewhere between 2 and 4% for most developed economies. 2.8% is the monthly increase. And if we have a look at how that compares to the rest of the previous 12 months, you can see that it's on the rise again. So in October, November, December, January and February, it was less than 2.8%. So it was trending in the right direction, but it started to creep back up again. In March, it was 3.7%. So it's come down compared to March, but it still tells us that it's rising. So if you were to annualize 2.8%, it would be somewhere in the 30s or 40% interest, because you have to compound the increase in inflation. So again, this tells us that things aren't quite fully on the road to recovery just yet in Argentina. Now, in terms of what's going on the monthly side of things over the past 3 years, you can see that 2.8% is pretty good compared to the previous couple of years where it was rising at much faster rates. In fact, in December 23, you can see that it rose by 25%, which is incredible. That's 1 month. That's not the annual rate. That's 1 month increase. So it's better than it was, but it's still not great. And if we look at what's going on with food inflation, in the month of April, it came in at 41.4%, which was the lowest at any time in the last 12 months. But 41% increase in food prices means that you need to be getting a 41% increase in your pension at least, just to be able to buy the same amount of food that you could buy this time last year. And if we look over the last 3 years at food inflation, you can see that at the end of 2023, start of 2024, it was up at around 300%. So completely unmanageable for most people. Now, in terms of growing the economy, which is the next target for Javier Milei, he's cut back on all the costs. So he's reduced the country's expenditure, but that isn't going to help Argentina get back on its feet. It's going to help cut back on its spending and reduce the amount of debt that it's taking on. But in order to get back into the black, it needs the economy to grow. And this chart shows both the annual and month-on-month increase in GDP dating back to 2022. The black line here shows the year-on-year movement in GDP, and the orange or brown line, depending how colorblind you are, like me, is the month-on-month movement. So if we focus in on what's happened in the most recently published data, you can see that year-on-year, Argentina has reported a 5.6% growth in GDP, which you might think, well, 5.6%, that sounds quite good. That's higher than a lot of other countries. It's higher than the expectation for the USA for this year, for example. However, there are a couple of things to note here. Firstly, the expectation for the latest data was to come in at 6.5%. So Argentina has undershot by 0.9%. That is a major shortfall. Also, when you're talking about year on year movements, you have to look at what happened last year because we're just comparing 5.6% growth against the previous 12 months. And if you look at what happened back in March 24, you can see that year on year, GDP actually crashed. It was down by around 8%. So we've got 5.6% growth compared to this time last year, but last year was a complete disaster. That represented a major fall in GDP. So it's bounced back up a bit, but we're still over the long term down from where Argentina was expecting to be. And if we look at the brown line, which shows the month on month movement, you can see that the latest data shows a 1.8% fall in GDP compared to last month. So that tells us that there's a problem, that GDP is now falling, that we're not seeing the increase that was expected. So this is concerning from Argentina's point of view because, as I said, it needs to be achieving growth in order to get back to where it wants to be. And this graph shows that same data in a slightly different format. It's a bit more traditional to what you're used to seeing. So I just wanted to show you this. So this shows the year-on-year movement in economic activity. So that's 5.6% in March. And you can see that that's down compared to February and January of 25. So we've now got a downward trend. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 3 years, it highlights what I've just been talking about, that the growth in March 24 was a major fall. The zero line is around about the middle of this chart. So you can see that it was minus 8% in March. So the 5.6% in March 25 is just a 5.6% increase compared to last year, which was an 8% fall. So if you're doing very rough calculations, that represents somewhere in the region of 2.5% down on a long-term basis. So if you look at the trend here, you can see that there's been a major downward trend in 22 and 23. And then in 24, we've seen a reversal of that trend. But the big question is it going to last? Is the trend going to continue, or are we going to see it starting to come back down again? And if we do, then that means Argentina is going to be in a world of pain. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been following what's been happening in Argentina for the past 3 years or more. And what we're seeing at the moment is that Javier Milei has achieved his initial expectation of cutting back on costs. He's reduced the amount of government bureaucracy. He's cut back on the number of government departments, number of staff. He's cut back on lots of different things all across the economy. So that's helping in terms of what Argentina is spending. And what we saw earlier in the video is that the pensioners in Argentina are very unhappy about that. They believe that their pensions should be increasing at a faster rate than they are to try to keep pace with what's going on with inflation. And as we saw, inflation is a little bit out of control still in Argentina. 47% is not a good result. It's a good result compared to where it's been, but it's not a good result overall. And we saw that month on month, inflation is still going up by 2.8%. So that is still too high. So Argentina is trying to get to grips with it. And we saw that Javier Milei has basically moved the peso in Argentina to being on a floating rate now. So he's removed the previous cap that was in place that was trying to manage the currency. And the reason that he's doing that is that he wants it to be floating and he wants to try to bring the economy back to life. So things are going okay on the cost and the management of the currency side, but in terms of growing the economy, which is the biggest challenge, if Argentina is going to become a major global force again, it needs its economy to start expanding. It needs to do more trade, it needs to do more business, produce more things, sell more things, export more things, earn more revenue, and move into the black. And what we've seen in today's data is that the latest growth figures have undershot from where Argentina thought it was going to be. We've seen a fall in GDP in the latest data of 1.8%. And that's a serious warning sign for Javier Milei that things might not be going exactly as he wants them to in terms of building up the trade, building up the revenue for Argentina. And if he doesn't get that back on track, if we don't start seeing that growth coming through, that's going to cause more problems because Argentina will have less money to be able to fund everything. And so it might need to cut back even further. Now, it did agree a massive deal with the IMF recently. So Argentina does have debt finance, but you need to put that debt finance to work. It needs to be used in investment to grow the economy, to grow business, to get Argentina back to the point where it's self-sufficient. It can earn enough revenue to pay for its own costs without needing to keep borrowing debt because it's the largest borrower at the IMF by a country mile. It's got billions, $44 billion worth of debt is almost more than all of the other countries put together. It's not quite, but it's a big number. And Argentina needs to use that money wisely to make sure that in 5 years' time, it's self-sufficient and doesn't need to keep borrowing from the IMF. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you bought me a coffee, sent me YouTube super thanks, thank you, really appreciate that. And if you're a long-term supporter, you're a legend, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership. That really keeps me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.